Hi there. Today we'll be talking about the way that historians have interpreted the period in American history and in the American South called Reconstruction. Before we begin, a quick summary. The Civil War ended in 1865. Everyone pretty much agrees that Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War when Americans fought over what the South and the nation should be like, can be broken up politically into three periods. The first of these is presidential Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1866. The second is congressional Reconstruction, which lasted from 1866 to sometime between 1869 and 1872. And the third of these is the counter-revolution that was once called Redemption, which started in some states as early as 1869 and had come to dominate the South by 1877. You'll perceive these different periods as we go, and I'll ask you to think about who was in control on a national level, President Andrew Johnson, Republicans in Congress, or Southern former Confederates, would affect how people behaved each other in their everyday lives. I'll also ask you to consider whether those questions of national control obscure what was happening on the ground. If you look at these categories, you'll see that even their names focus on presidents and Congress. That, of course, excludes white Southerners in the first two of these, and excludes African Americans in all of them. As we look through our documents, we'll have reason to question just how much agency black and white Southerners had in determining how things went down. But, getting past that very basic chronology, I want to get to the arguments people have been making about Reconstruction, so that you can start thinking about where the evidence leads. These can be broken down into two major categories. And I'll ask you to think about other possibilities stemming from that second category. The first category of arguments about Reconstruction goes all the way back to when professional historians started being trained in graduate school in the 1880s and 1890s. Graduate school is, of course, where historians are trained, and all of my colleagues, as well as I, studied history there. Way back in the 1890s, like right after Reconstruction, the most important historian studying Reconstruction was named William Archibald Dunning, and it was his interpretation, which historians call, not terribly surprisingly, the Dunning School, that remained most powerful among most historians through the 1950s, and the general public through at least the 1970s. And I should add, by the way, that from here on out, virtually all the images we're going to see are extremely offensive. That's what you get when you study a racist time, and racist histories of that time. Dunning's argument was that Reconstruction consisted largely of Northern economic interests trying to remake the South in order to benefit Northern industrialists. To do this, Northern industrialists and politicians supposedly exploited newly freed slaves, manipulating them into voting for corrupt governments. You can see that idea here. You don't need to know the details of what's going on here to know that Louisiana, in the figure of a white woman, is being murdered. And if you look closer, you can see that the black men who are stretching this white woman out on the altar are being egged on by men dressed in top hats and fancy suits, Northern industrialists and other wealthy men, presumably. If this was true, then what happened next would have seemed, and it did seem that way to Dunning and his acolytes, quite reasonable. That would be redemption, so-called, in which paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan heroically reclaim the South from black people and their corrupt Northern supporters. I hope you can hear the ironic quotation marks I'm inserting around all of these words. Indeed, the word redemption refers to the notion that the Klan and other groups like him redeemed the South from the tyranny of black rule, and again with the ironic quotation marks. Dunning's argument was enormously influential, not to mention racist, and if past experience is any guide, probably influenced the way you were taught about Reconstruction in high school. But it was answered by a number of scholars, among them W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar and activist. Beginning in the early 1900s and gaining steam through the middle of the 20th century, Du Bois and others argued that Reconstruction wasn't about white exploitation of African Americans or the Northern exploitation of the South. Instead, they argued that Reconstruction was about African Americans and a significant number of whites, too, trying to make the South and America a place where anyone, not just wealthy landowners, could have a chance to attain a measure of freedom and equality. In Du Bois's view, African Americans participating in politics, like these early black men elected to Congress and the Senate, weren't the dupes of corrupt whites, but people making a good faith effort to create a political and social system that might encourage equality and civil liberties. As you consider that idea, I'll ask you to think about what methods they used to try to accomplish that, and why they chose those methods instead of others. You might also consider whether African Americans' attempts to make a more equal South really were, as their opponents argued, radical. Meanwhile, in Du Bois's telling, groups like the Klan go from heroic redeemers to terrorists bent on reinstituting slavery. Again, I'll ask you, as Du Bois does, to think about what motivated these people. So that's the old debate. According to the Dunning School, Reconstruction was a corrupt attempt to overthrow the South's racial and labor systems on behalf of Northern industrialists, using former slaves as puppets, an attempt that was thankfully put down by Southern patriots. Du Bois's revisionists, on the other hand, argued that Reconstruction was an attempt by former slaves themselves to use legal and political means to overthrow the South's racial and labor systems, and it was terribly put down by white supremacists. But that's not the end of things. Indeed, for most historians, the people who spend all day and most of the night studying this stuff, the debate, which defined over 100 years of historiography, is over, and Du Bois and his followers won. That's not to say professional historians are always right. Indeed, you owe it to the evidence to think about this stuff for yourself. But the evidence they've presented is strongly on the side of the second option, the Du Bois school. Very few people take Dunning's arguments seriously today. And if that's the case, and I leave it to you to decide whether it is or not, then there are new questions that need answering, questions that historians haven't settled. There are more questions than the three I'm going to suggest, but you might consider these three before and while you branch off into other areas. First, as you think about the arc of the period from the Civil War to so-called redemption, ask yourself, did slavery actually end? What might your criteria be for deciding that African Americans emerged from Reconstruction with their freedom? If slavery continued but under another name, or even if African Americans simply were less free than they should have been, why did it go that way? And whom did that benefit? Meanwhile, you might also think about African Americans' methods of achieving freedom. How and why did their strategies change, and what resulted from it? Second, government. How and why did the government change in Reconstruction? The federal government has a reputation for having grown precipitously. Did it grow enough for everyday Americans to suddenly perceive its presence in their lives where they hadn't before? And if it grew, what resulted from that growth? Did it increase or diminish Americans, and, by the way, which Americans, access to liberty? And to what extent were those changes intentional? What did various Americans think about government, and how and why did their ideas change during this period? Did Southern, not to mention Northern, whites and blacks have different ideas about liberty and equality? Where did those ideas come from, and how did they play out in terms of how they expected to accomplish them? Finally, what does Reconstruction reveal about America in general in the 19th century? A number of historians have argued that we should look at Reconstruction not as a Southern phenomenon, but as a national one. But it's not yet entirely clear what would result from thinking about it that way. Here's one place to go. What did Americans, and again, which Americans, think their nation was for? The easy answers seem to be freedom and equality, but you can perceive how those words' meanings could change from person to person, not to mention people's ideas of how to secure them. But if you step back, you might find other competing ideals, civilization, for instance, or white supremacy, or sexual purity, or religious piety. How did Americans define and respond to these and other ideas as they went about putting themselves back together?